had an insight that psych meds, in a way, are artificial thought, because the process that is induced by the universe on the brain is actually something that's beyond thought, which makes up the personal self. It's non-personal, and it's a non-personal process that gets rid of some of that personal stuff, or all of it temporarily, and we're temporarily disoriented. But in a way, taking psych meds after is a way to maintain an artificial self, a functional center. It's to prevent that universal process from happening, which makes us somewhat disidentify from our personal selves and act non-personally. But the structure of society as it is doesn't know how to respond to people that are acting in this non-personal way. And it eventually gets to a place where that non-personal person is feared, and then that non-personal person responds to that fear, and then it looks like that person has a personal problem, when really it's a non-personal problem. It's a problem of how to be in this society, in this non-person state. And I was thinking about how we speak the language of thought in relationship, of memory, past, and the personal self. And I was wondering if one can speak the language of insight and Gaia and insight into nature, and just keep speaking that language. It's a different way of relating. It's relating one's perceptions, not relating based on past images. And I'm also wondering if I can share some of my insights to myself during the day in self-dialogue instead of writing them down or saving them for later. We'll see. I was thinking about the concept of healing and how we need healing because we're not playing. And how mania is failed attempts at play. And treatment is to trick us back into the old tricks of society's meaningless meanings. It's rememing our rememing process. And I wonder if we were on our original childlike trajectory, would we need healing? And I wrote down, we don't need supervision, we have supervision. As in super space vision. And I've been thinking about communication, though I haven't really unfolded what I'm thinking about it in particular, even though all of this is communication. And I looked up the term nature mysticism. And I think that describes reading nature and giving voice to nature and understanding and learning from nature. And I was listening to a talk about spiritual emergency and how the Brazilian spiritist paradigm feels like sometimes it's suppressed mediumship, meaning the spiritual emergency or so-called psychosis is a result of suppressed mediumship or Maybe another way to say that is being highly sensitive and not using those gifts. But in terms of suppressed mediumship, I was thinking, to play with those words, I was thinking, we are the mediumship, or we are the medium's ship. And by that I mean the medium is life, and we are the vehicle of that life. So we are the medium's ship. Not just that we have mediumship, but we are the medium's ship, and we're not really using that ship wisely. It would be like having a ship on the sea, or actually trying to put a car on the sea. It's the wrong ship for that medium. We are the vehicle of human life, and we are using that life wrongly, and then we need healing, and then we need mediums to help us heal, when really the medium is life, and we're just not translating that life with our vehicle of the life that we're given. If we use a ship to try and drive through the sand, it's going to need healing, it's going to need fixing. But if the ship is in the right medium, we don't need any kind of healing or any kind of mediumship. We have the wrong meanings, and then we need healing from wrong meanings. If we weren't programmed with wrong meanings, we wouldn't need healing. And all that really needs healing is perception, because if we can see, we can make meaning, not be healed from bad meanings just to have new programmed meanings superimposed over old, obsolete meanings that only has a limited value. We only need perception moment to moment to see what things really mean, and moment to moment to make sense with our senses. We're not able to make sense with our senses because we're not sensing with our senses. We're superimposing thought structures, and that blocks our senses. And because our senses are blocked, we can't make meaning, and because we can't make meaning, we need healing. And I feel like I want to unfold further this whole notion of insight. And insight, perception, and intelligence are closely related. If one can have insight, that means one has perception. And perception is utilized by intelligence. But I feel like insight is a deprogramming language, whereas thought structures are programs. And I thought of an interesting term, profoundly crazy, because I'm a crazy person, yet maybe I'm saying some things that are profound, but maybe not. But anyway, it's more of a play on words that I'm profoundly crazy, whether or not anything that I say has any kind of profundity. Maybe it has pro-fun in it, as in for having fun. Ditty. And I was thinking about thought and how we feel like thought is actually healthy, except when it gets too extreme. We feel like it's okay if we have so-called healthy thought, and it's sort of like playing in a stream and thinking, oh, this is fun playing in a stream. But if it's a raging river, then it's too scary. But it's all the same stuff, and a stream can turn into a raging river through the powers of the universe. I feel like insight, when one has perception and insight, it produces high quality sound and not the noise of the ego. And I was thinking about how when the ego voice inside is turned up, then more of our brain capacity is on that, so our vision is turned down. But when the sound inside, the interpretation, the map, thought inside is turned down, then our eyes naturally have to be more watchful. Because it's like putting a blindfold on the ears. the noise is turned down inside on what we think is happening. And when that happens, we need to turn up our visual capacity to see what is actually happening in order to respond, because we're not responding in accordance with our programming. And I was thinking about when we hear sound on the outside and we don't know what it is, we look around to see what it is and we try to figure it out. Yet all the sounds that we have playing inside of our head are actually the opposite. They're all the things that we think we've already figured out. So the whole thought-sound structure is something figuring that it has things figured out. And it tries to figure into the picture. And they're literally image sound figures in the moving picture of reality that have little to do with reality, but are figuring that they've figured it out. It's like this energy that figures it's figured stuff out, so it doesn't really have to look. Maybe it's lazy eyes. And so these sounds prevent listening with our eyes and ears, and with our whole being in the present moment, because these thoughts and sounds are a movement away from the present moment. The current light of the present moment is a current of learning delight. Learning is light, and light is perception. Can we stream learning instead of streaming thought? Can we stream the mind? They talk about live streaming on the internet, and thought is dead streaming. It's streaming old dead information through our brains. Thought is dead streaming, superimposing the old over the ever new present moment. It's actually a limiter. It's limiting the energy of consciousness, light, and the mind and perception, insight and intelligence. I feel like there is a switch for neurogenesis that has something to do with light and sound. So when our brains are in sound and in light dominant, when we have playing with light and sound in our consciousness, but it's old, recycled light and sound from memory, it's in a way recycling the brain cells. And I feel like this switch to neurogenesis is when the light comes in and there's perception, and that alters the brain and helps it to grow. So it's this switch where instead of creating images with the sound of our thoughts, we're producing the sound of our voice in the moment with the light coming in of perception. I feel like there could be a genetic switch there, because Dr. Bruce Lipton talks about how perception changes genetics. So that could even be at the cellular and DNA level, or even at the organismal level of actually perceiving with one's eyes. Last night I read a tweet that said something about how observing a number of trees and shrubs and birds can improve mental health. And they did a study where they counted like the number of birds and varieties and things like that people would see, and if it affected their mental health. And it showed to have a positive
benefit. And I was thinking, well, duh. Like, why do we need science? Like, why are scientists doing science on these, like, totally obvious things? Why not just give the money to the people in the study so they can actually go out and maybe get a bird instead of studying the obvious? It's so ridiculous. And I had an insight into insight and sharing. Feeling like just by sharing insight, it will maybe provide insight into what it's like to see, if I see and speak as that which I see, as opposed to just the me. And in this way, I'm learning a new language. I'm using language in terms of perception, which is seeing in the moment as opposed to thought and past me constructs. And I remember when I first went into so-called mania 6 years ago, I was trying to create new words and new language. So I think that was actually part of the process, was this instinct to create a new language based on the way my brain was now working. And maybe by speaking in that way, in that new language, which isn't necessarily different from English, but it's using English differently instead of English using us. And that would reinforce that way of seeing and communicating in the brain. So it's the brain wanting to communicate in a different way based on seeing connections. And I was watching Krishnamurti's talk with Dr. David Bohm called The Future of Humanity. And Krishnamurti mentioned that thought dominates our relationships, or that thought has become dominant in human relationships. And I was thinking to myself, well, what else could become dominant in human relationships? And that might be speaking as insight, or speaking based on insights and perceptions. And again, it's this reversal switch of neurogenesis, using the light of perception to create sound, and then doing that together and thinking together. And I had a conversation with one of my friends today, and it seems that we're going to be attempting to play with some ideas and just see what happens. And after our 3-hour conversation, I had this sense that he and I have the same brain. Like, we're able to talk that way for that long because we have the same brain. Because I was in a dialogue the other day and I raised the question, and I don't even know if I said this to myself, that if we all left all our past conditioning at the door and we were all a clean slate adult brain, what would we talk about? What would that conversation and dialogue look like? And in that way, I feel like his brain and my brain are pretty congruent. It's almost like, even though our brains aren't entirely conditioning free, we have these same values through our experiences, and I feel like our brains have been transformed and transmuted in these same ways. So we had a conversation and figured out that we can go about this process of being co-creative and just seeing what happens. And I think that's cool because it's a way to have dialogue with another person, to put certain things into play, because it's not just about talking about how a manic brain works and reframing and creating that context for the manic brain to see itself as just fine the way it is, but then also putting the manic brain to work. So it's one way for it to see how it works, and it's another way for it to go to work. So we're going to go to work together, and we're going to go to work in the manic way, and which is just infinite and chaotic. And it's almost like this new generating ideas and pruning the ideas together and putting our brains together and seeing what happens. And it's possible that nothing will happen, and it's possible that something will happen, but we can't even really know what that is. And it might take a while for it to kind of get going, or it could, I have no idea how it's going to go, but what I'm saying is, I was even saying to him that even in talking with myself, I have to look at the page and then say my idea and then talk for a while and then go to the next. But in conversation with him, we talked for 3 hours nonstop, and there was no pausing to look at a notebook. So there's no editing. So the process of talking to oneself isn't as powerful as putting one's brain together with another, even just in creating dialogue and conversation. It's more natural because we can just pass that energy back and forth. And he gave me permission to talk about this to myself, and I want to talk about it here and there because it's sort of the next iteration of the conversation, is having that conversation with somebody else, and not just about the context I've created for myself, which I can't remember anyways, but what can we create when we both have brains of similar context? And I think that it's one thing to want to heal, and it's another thing to be creative, and then the concept of healing loses its meaning. And I was thinking about even my journey to want to come off meds. If I'm being co-creative and able to design a life exactly how I would envision, or even in alignment with the vision that I was shown and given the blueprint of in Mania, then maybe that is the healing, and then the need to basically coming off meds might be easier when I'm living a life that is in alignment with that vision. And the chances of me creating that vision are higher if I'm in alignment with somebody else. And I think I already talked about how psychoactive drugs, in a way, are a way to keep the psyche and thought in order, when the process of map consciousness is actually something beyond thought. So it's like taking those drugs is like artificial thought, whereas the process of map consciousness is introducing a new form of intelligence. It's not really new, but it's new to most of us. And so it's an artificial self. And I think that's pretty similar to what I talked about with the chemical ego band-aid. And I wrote down that the amount of healing we need is inversely proportional to the amount of play and laughter we have. And playing with ideas and being creative, I feel like that goes along with play. It's a creative play, because this process we're going to start doesn't really have a motive, and it can go anywhere. So if it turns into something creative or business-esque, it would almost be like business for manic brains, because so many of us are thought to be non-functional or having a difficult time functioning, but really it's just that the way our brains function is not being seen, and only we can see it, those of us who experience it. So we'll be playing not just with these ideas, but playing with how we might be able to create stuff. And I feel like insight and perception and intelligence is antivirus software. So again, thought is mind viruses, our own voice turned against ourself, and insight and perception, when we see something and we understand, it changes those structures. So it changes the thought and language viruses. And it's a different language, it's a deprogramming language. And I also had an insight when I was falling asleep, and I actually got up and wrote it down, because I had one or two the nights before and I didn't write them down, and I don't remember them. And I remember feeling like, I like that one, I want to keep it. So I wrote down that if the brain is not seeing meaning, it makes up stories. So it's always making up stories about me and the past and all these things. But if it's seeing meaning, it doesn't need to make up stories. Because it's hearing the language of the actual now, the meaning in the now, the relationships, the relatedness. And I had the sense of that because for some reason I felt a little story coming into my brain about something, and I sort of just saw this relationship between meaning and stories. Stories are like past content mixed together and rearranged and blah blah blah, whereas meaning, those stories need to be quiet if we're going to see anything meaningful, because stories are seen as meaning, but they're old dead meanings. Whereas if we're seeing meanings in the present, which is an ever flowing of awe that doesn't feel like awe because it's always just flowing, then our brain isn't going to make up stories. So to go with my co-creative project with my friend, I need to see if I can get my brain back into idea mode and how I want to share those ideas with him. And I feel like I talk about the way my brain works to use the brain in order to see. So seeing how the brain works, the brain can see. If the brain can see how it works, it can then see beyond just how it works. It can see how the universe works, because the universe works on the same rules as the brain, because the brain is that which we perceive the universe with. And the brain is learning this language of how to talk about how it works in order to learn another language altogether. It's translating the brain to be primarily this sound resonating device into a device of perceiving the light and giving voice to it. And when we can do that together, we can see the same thing together. We can talk about the same thing. We can unfold the same thing, which is our vision. I have some other notes, but I don't even know if I talked about them. I wrote down that we try to be good at remembering, but we need to be good at forgetting all the stuff that's in our mind, so something else can arise. Because when the brain is quiet, it can respond to the whole field of the mind. And I was talking to somebody, and it was interesting because we were talking about how sound and sight go together, and touch and gesture and movement. It's all this holistic thing, yet we separate the senses like they're these separate things, but really they're not. By looking at somebody's mouth while they're talking, we can understand what they're saying better. So the movement of their mouth is part of the communication. So in that same way, when we're perceiving holistically, we're perceiving so many dimensions of the whole field. And I was thinking about how sights become sounds, because I came out of a building and I looked up and I saw something, I think maybe the moon or something, and I said almost out loud, "Look at that." And I was saying it as if somebody was with me. And in a way, perception, seeing something so beautiful, there's this response to give voice to it and share that. Nobody was with me, but I said, "Look at that." Not just, oh, would you look at that, to myself, but look at that. So this perception wants to share the perception and see something together at the same time. I think there might be a direct correlation, an inverse relationship between thought and insight. And as one goes into map consciousness, one has more access to insight, the language of insight, hyperperception. And it's especially energizing and foreign the first time. But one, as one goes into those states more often, gets used to that language. And I don't mean language as in just words, but the whole energy field of it, impressing upon our body, mind, nervous system, and all of our senses, starts to attune us to that medium. Just like if we practice going in cold water, we'll get used to being in cold water and it won't really feel that cold. So it's being acclimated to those higher states or those other states. And then they don't necessarily even feel like higher states. They just feel like natural states that we have access to. Just like one can train to run a marathon and have access to that state physically, but one can also choose to walk. So, and walking and running a marathon aren't necessarily better than each other. It's just different abilities to use one's physicality in lots of different dimensions of what it means to be human. So it's just these other human dimensions that we might think are strange because people don't exercise in those domains. They just fear them. That would be like being afraid of a marathon runner because we can't run a marathon. And I might have said this one too. I need to keep track better of what I'm doing because now I'm writing stuff in notebooks. Because if I'm out and about, then I can just look at the notebook instead of having my laptop with my notes. But I wrote, we don't have enough random access memory when we're accessing memories randomly. Or even we think we are this random access memory, this RAM on the computer. But usually there's only several gigabytes of RAM accessing memory, but the hard drive is comparatively massive. And we can be the hard drive when we just stay in the whole field of information, and then the random accessor becomes the universal process of perception, the light coming towards us, the information coming into us. I feel like we are mishearing and misseeing the universe. And we don't hear the universe because we hear the me saying its verses. And I really think I said this stuff, but I don't actually know for sure. And that's the trouble with, for me, trying to create anything beyond just talking to myself, is that I don't have any memory, very vague. And I was thinking about Dr. Daniel Siegel, how he says the mind uses the brain to create itself. And when I thought about that, I sort of had this sense, I am the mind. Or when one disidentifies from the ego self, then one is the mind. There's no I to be the mind. There's just mind. And there was one other thing. I saw this wiki article about this Juana Maria of these islands off the coast of California. Someone told me about it. And then I read her wiki story, and it said something like she was living on this island for 18 years by herself. And then they brought her to the coast, and 7 weeks later she was dead. And they said 7 weeks later she was dead from these diseases. And I was thinking to myself, no, she was in this beautiful paradise and adapted to that. And then she was brought into this toxic society, and 7 weeks later she was dead. To me, it was more of an illustration of that, not that she had some kind of illness. She probably had no immunity to the diseases of society, and she wasn't adapted to that at all, and she quickly died. It just made me think of people diagnosed with mental illnesses and how, in a way, our consciousness goes to paradise and then we come back to this world with everyone else. It's like we go to this island of paradise in our mind that's also here, but our consciousness goes there, and then when our consciousness comes back here, it nearly dies. And I wrote down, make sense of the senses. And then we don't have to make sense, we just sense. And I was thinking about this language that it seems my brain is learning to speak, and I wonder if I speak nature. I'm starting to learn the language of this land, the different bird sounds, the hummingbirds, the lizards, the sound of oranges falling. It goes on. When one is perceiving that and learning the language of that movement and those sounds and those sights and those smells, what else is there? And I was reading something by Krishnamurti, and he said, if one could be educated to discover the factors that produce order, it would have a great significance. And I have a feeling that has something to do with this language. It's the language of the order of nature, our relationship to it, and that includes us. And I opened a book, and randomly it opened to this page that said, and it was a quote by Krishnamurti, and it was the only quote on the page. It just said, when you destroy nature, you destroy yourself. And I'm pretty sure I talked to myself about how we are nature. So in speaking the language of nature and speaking as nature, we're actually speaking as ourself. And I actually feel like people who go into map consciousness, sometimes they connect with nature and the pain of nature, because it's nature trying to communicate with us through us at a distance, because it feels that we're disconnecting from it and thus destroying it. But it's translated into stuff against ourselves eventually, because we are destroying nature, so we're destroying ourselves. But then it seems like our thoughts are destroying us, but that's one way that probably nature can destroy us, is with our thoughts against ourselves. But it's just nature doing it. It's the whole of everything. There's no separation. That being said, it could happen that if it reaches a point where nature is getting destroyed too quickly, there could just be mass confusion in human beings at some point, to the point where there's more people that are supposedly crazy than sane. I feel like it would be cool to unfold some of this order. Part of that order would be seeing something for oneself. So seeing something directly versus being told and then remembering and then conforming to that as a pattern. When you can see directly for yourself, you don't need patterns, you don't need habits. There might be things that appear sort of habitual to others, but they're not necessary. We need sensitivity, freedom to see, and to see the relationships between things. And there's an expansiveness in that. It's 9 a.m. and it's already really warm. And it's nice in the shade. Though I do want to get some sun time in, for sure. This morning I was again listening to the birds in this one particular spot that
there's quite the symphony of birds and, oh, a lizard. He's looking right at the sun. And there was this one particular bird song, and I don't know the kinds of birds and what they sing, but it was just so detailed and beautiful. I could just sense that they were really talking to each other, because one would sing the song and then the other, and it was quite complex in terms of the notes and the tempo, and I could hear these little birds chirping, like maybe the mom bird was singing to her babies so they could learn the song themselves, and how her singing the song would almost create the brain cells those little babies needed in order to sing the song when they grow up. Because I don't think they practice and then get the song wrong. I think they just sing it when they do sing it. So it must be in their brain somehow. But I almost started to tear up just because it was so beautiful. And then I could hear the bees buzzing. It sounded like a faint swarm all around me, but really it's just so silent that the space is there for the bee buzzing frequency. And even when I was hearing all the birds, I had this sense that all the birds are here together, so they need to have their own song and occupy their own frequency, not just even occupying their own space and time, in space and time, but having that frequency for their song. And in the same way, I feel like map consciousness is a different frequency for humans to start singing a different song, giving voice to something different. I just love the sound of the hummingbirds. They sound like little machines, like, I don't know if you can hear that. It just sounds like a little squeaky mechanical part, but it's this tiny little bird sitting there looking for his friends. And I took a video of the bees buzzing, and I've taken a couple other clips of things, and maybe I'll share some of them throughout, because part of it is learning to speak the language of beauty in nature. And I feel like we could speak a language of beauty just among human beings, but maybe it's easier to learn that language around nature. And I just had this insight that consciousness holds us up in gravity. So at nighttime we go to sleep, and it's like our consciousness has set, just like the sun sets. It's still there, it's just sort of set beyond the horizon. So when our consciousness sets, it's this inner darkness where we're not really conscious, and we go to sleep, and we're no longer holding ourselves up in gravity. So consciousness, in a way, is anti-gravity. And gravity has an effect on matter, but I'm not sure if it has an effect on light. So in this conversion of matter into light through perception, perhaps gravity has less of an effect. And the other thing with the bees is I heard this loud bee buzzing. And I'm going to let the crow have his time on the video, and I will occupy my own space and let him crow in between, because that's fine. But the bee, it was such a loud bee, and I looked over and it was a big bumblebee, and it was like 30 feet away. Yet I could hear this thing like it was right beside me. And again, that's the silence. And I feel like the same thing can happen with silence and consciousness, then one can sense things a lot more strongly, even if they're far away. Different energies and vibrations and perceptions. What do you want? And I realized last night that now might be a good time to go through my old original manic notes for some of my strange ideas, since my friend and I are going to be playing with strange ideas. Not all of them strange, but just playing with ideas together in this manic creative way and see what happens. It's sort of like what happens when two people that have been labeled with stuff put their brains together in knowing that their brains have something that they want to unfold and create, not knowing exactly what that is, and seeing what happens. So I have been unfolding and creating this self-dialogue with myself. And now what do I create with somebody else, which is something beyond just talking to myself about reframes, about map consciousness and trans consciousness. That has a certain value, but then understand map consciousness and trans consciousness for what? It's one thing to create the context, it's the next thing to be embodied as creating with an understanding of that context. Hey! That was funny. I went, hey, and the bird was like, caw, caw, caw. Let's see. Hey! 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 Shh! That's enough. I'm trying to make a video here. Why doesn't this bird understand that I'm trying to make a video? I'm trying to talk to myself. I listened to the birds all morning, and I'm done listening to the birds. He said, yeah, no, I don't care. Why don't you make like a bunny and be quiet, bird? It seems like he's applying the principle of if you're lost, if you've lost your mom, stay put, don't move, she will find you. Do not go with anyone else. So he's just sitting there calling out. He's lost the radius of awareness, because I've noticed that so many of these birds, they call to each other back and forth, and the bird closest to me calls out, and then I can hear a bird far, far away calling out, and they seem to stay within earshot of each other. Who knows if their hearing is more or less sensitive, but it's a hummingbird. Yeah, I don't know if this bird is going to give me my own silent external space. I remember now talking about finding dialogue partners as a kind of dating in a way. Wanting to share that space and time, but not necessarily physical space. And it seems like I found a co-creative brain. And we'll be supporting each other in our co-creation, not just trying to help each other with symptoms and things. So in that way, we're acknowledging the original process
and how the brain enters a creative hyper-learning state, and going with that as opposed to trying to fix our symptoms. Yet we both have this understanding that our brains might possibly go into hyperspeed, but we'll be able to support each other in that. Again, it's about just create. It's the process. It's not about what. It's not about a goal. It's not about a particular thing, because that narrows it down. Part of it will possibly be showing the process of getting into a supported creative process. And it could be like being parallel quantum processors. In a way, we might need to gather more brains, but I'm not sure. The other brains would really have to get it, because we were talking to each other about how we've known each other for 1.5 years, and we've been having long conversations here and there throughout. So because of that, we have an established trust and understand that we share the same values. I even said to him that I wouldn't even care if he took all my ideas. They're not even my ideas. And then if he just took them all and stopped talking to me, I would only care that he stopped talking to me, but not about the ideas, because in this process, there's an understanding that ideas are unlimited and we can't carry them all out on our own, nor do we want to. There's ones we don't want to even do, but maybe somebody else does. So I talked about this before, how in business, a person will get one idea and they'll work 20 years on it. Whereas people with these types of brains that go into the creative state get 1,000 ideas in a day, yet can't do anything with them. So there's this idea about the scarcity of ideas. And in a way, ideas might be a new currency, an exchange, and then people that carry them out can do so, the ones that want to. So we sort of unfolded something, but who knows what'll happen with it. And that'll be just part of this self-dialogue, but self-dialoguing about co-creation, possibly. And even in my self-dialogues, I've talked about things that I want to create. So it's possible that that will be made more possible throughout this co-creative process. I can sort of see that it's a process of making things possible. And I had an insight. I've been saying that our own voice gets turned against ourself. But then I also realized that our own voice is ourself. It creates the ego self and the me. It's just our own voice repeating in our head. And when we see that that's not anything at all, then it loses its strength. And I mentioned that map consciousness is a deprogramming language. And I talked before about how it seems like this whole process where the brain can have altered states of consciousness is a fail-safe, so the brain, which is a living thing, can't get programmed into machine-like action. And we already have, but it ensures that we can't ultimately get programmed into machine-like action. And the deprogramming language is life itself. So thoughts are mechanical machinery that get us to act based on programs, and life itself is the deprogramming language, the energy of life and living and chaos and complexity and change and flux and flow. And also actually just seeing nature and understanding the language of nature will deprogram us from being so identified with this me self that we think is so important. So life itself cannot be written over by words. And words are constructs and things we use to judge and categorize things, but life is not actually according to human categories. Those categories can be somewhat useful and beneficial, but they can also be very destructive. Yet words, which are very limited, and categories and
human abstractions and concepts cannot write over life. Life created those words. So life would not have within itself the allowance for words, which is a very small subset of life, to destroy life. So life allowed words and language to evolve, but now it seems like that has been used to too much detriment. And so we're having people born not able to acquire language or something like that. Words can be used to point out life's artful relatedness, or it can be used for division. And we each have an inner dictator. It's dictating with words what we should see and categorize and judge, and those are all programs we're moving according to. And there are no dictators, it's just thought. Yeah, so I saw that very clearly last night when I was getting ready to go to sleep, and that one almost freaked me out when I see those things that are, they can be warped in a kind of scary way. Because I feel like in so-called psychosis, it's thought, it's all of that energy, and it nearly destroys a single person. But if one is able to see through that and get through it, maybe one day one can just brush those words off one's sleeve and understand that those words cannot destroy the life that one is. So even if those words are going on in the mind and consciousness, trying to get the organism to destroy itself, if one just lays there and surrenders, it can't do that. Words cannot destroy life. And so in learning this language of relatedness and insight, when one sees that relatedness and that we are nature, one doesn't destroy nature, and then nature starts to respond to us again. It's a hummingbird. I don't know if you saw that. That was so cool. I've never seen one in the middle of the air like that. So hopefully you saw that. Apparently in a couple of weeks there'll be a lot of hummingbirds here, and I'll try and get some video. I feel like seeing hummingbirds heals the brain. Such a miraculous being. And the other day I heard a siren for the first time, and it was actually because I was outside walking and I was listening to some of my video audios. I've only listened to a couple. And I heard a siren from the video audio, and I was like, whoa, I haven't heard an ambulance or a fire truck in 3 weeks. And I was thinking about how getting used to cold water turns off the shivering response, and how getting used to manic consciousness, or even just a flux and flow in consciousness, turns off the behaviors that we need to prune out response. So just like if one first jumps in a freezing cold pool of water, they're going to jump out in a big reaction. So when one gets used to this flux and flow of consciousness, this sensitivity, and one starts to understand what one is sensitive to, then one doesn't have such a on-off reaction, like move towards or run away. One can start to be with it and understand the richness of that, and understand that staying with it will give an unfolding, flowering of information. Because we're so used to, with our ego judgments, good, bad, right, wrong, yes, no, desire, pain, It's just so on or off. So when we first get in touch with this richness that isn't about on or off, yes or no, we still have that response. And so we can have so-called behavior problems when it's not that. It's just we're learning how to be with that richness, with the old pattern behaviors that we're used to of fight or flight or good or bad, or, oh yes, this suits my little fancy that I've been programmed to be attuned to, or not. Last night I woke up because I had a tickle in my throat. Well, I hadn't quite fallen asleep yet. And at the same time, I had this heart pounding and sort of fear, and sort of like this subtle fear of death at the same time. And it was really interesting. And I felt like writing down that death is a tickle in the back of the throat while falling asleep and getting used to it. It just felt like a very quick and subtle dying. But in a way it could be good, because getting used to that daily death, as opposed to waiting for that big one to accumulate every 6.5 to 8.5 months, as it is for my internal process, it seems. Maybe it would be better to have just a small daily one than waiting for that big one. And I was talking in my last video about getting used to the cold turns off the shiver reflex, and I wonder if getting used to map consciousness or mania or higher states and fluxing states might turn off the shiver of psychosis. And interestingly enough, when I've had so-called psychosis, I usually do have a shiver response. And I also had a bit of a sense that that time when my consciousness left my body and went into a bird, and I was flying all over the place, and then it went into other things as well, but I had this thought that maybe my consciousness went into the bird to fly everywhere and see what's happening from the perspective of a bird. So in a way, I had this bird's eye view of the world, even though I don't remember seeing it. I just remember being the bird and the sensations of that. But I had this sense that the mind is trying to see through the brain. The one mind that makes up everything, the one consciousness. It sees through the birds, it sees through brains. The brain is sort of the physical apparatus that allows the mind to see itself and all aspects of itself. So by being a bird temporarily, consciousness was able to have a bird's eye view. And it seems that humanity has its own images of me and its own individual needs and desires and goals apart from the mind. And that actually blocks the mind from seeing itself. And it blocks the human from seeing itself as everything else, as connected and related in an aspect of the all. So I feel like in that experience, in a way, my consciousness died to this body temporarily. It left my body and went into a higher consciousness than even being a human being, which is a bird. Which maybe isn't even higher consciousness per se, it just is a different way of seeing. And one can see further what's happening in the world. Like a bird must kind of know there's something wrong when there's not enough trees for it to have a proper community of its own species and other bird species, etc. So the mind wants to see through the human brain, because the mind is seeing through the brain full of its own
stuff, full of its own memories and experiences, which have nothing to do with nature. And we are nature. And it doesn't mean there's no place for human constructs, but by seeing through the mind, the human constructs would likely take their natural place. Because right now they're more expanding like cancer. Cancer destroys the body, and humanity is destroying its body, which is Earth. Earth is our real body. Without the Earth, we wouldn't have bodies. Maybe that's what's missing in terms of planets being inhabited, is that consciousness has to imbue the planet with consciousness in order for life to arise from that consciousness. And it's possible that other planets could have life on it, and we might be looking right at it, and we would still not be able to see it. Because we look at our planet and we can't even really fully be with the life that's on our planet. We can't really sense it. So if we can't fully sense the life here, how would we be able to sense the life on another planet? If we can't sense the life of a bird here and its importance, how would we even have the sensitivity to even sense other forms of life? We can't even see what's right in front of us. We can only see our own constructs. And so if we're looking for our own constructs on other planets, which have nothing to do with life, then we're never going to find it. For some reason, A Course in Miracles popped into my head, and I was thinking that map consciousness is sort of like a course in magic, which is similar to miracles. And I was also thinking that it's sort of like magic coursing through the body. It's sort of a course in being animated by that magic, which is just life. It's being animated by life as opposed to thought structures and patterns. It's being animated by the moment. And in a way, it's a different obstacle course. So normal consciousness has its ego thought structures as the obstacle course. It's trying to get past the obstacles that it itself has imposed upon itself, and by doing that it creates the self. It's not a very interesting game. There's a tiny spider on my phone. What are you doing? The obstacle is the ego. And the only real thing to do is just see past it. And that shouldn't be that difficult, because it's just this sort of illusion of thoughts and sounds and images. Just look at a real something and you're seeing past it. Looking without the word about the thing that one is looking at. And it could be that the obstacle of the game, I don't know if that's how you say that, the objective of the game. And it could be that the objective of the game is to live a life without the obstacle of the obstacle maker. I feel like if we're sensitive to these things, then life is rich, and we are rich, and we are richness. It's not just about the 9 senses or 5 senses, depending on how you look at it. They all meld together, and then their flux and flow creates this infinite richness of sensing. So the 5 senses become sensitivity. And we speak as that sensitivity. It's not just about hearing and touch. It's understanding the whole language of all the senses together. And when we do that, we can actually understand the language of the sense impressions that we're getting in the moment and speaking as that. We've narrowed life down to a few desires, wants, goals. So we have this very limited band of goals and desires, and we make life about seeking out that, which could be an infinitesimally small amount of the richness available in reality and in life. So we're looking for a needle in a haystack because we have this very selective thing that we're looking for. But if we're just looking, that which we're looking at impresses upon our sensitivity and gives us this sense of richness moment to moment. Not richness because of a certain thing. It's just a richness of being alive. But most of us don't feel alive because we're looking for a needle in a haystack. And we've been told that once we find that needle, we're going to be happy. When happiness is being sensitive to the richness of the moment, because it's so infinite. It's so infinite. Like yesterday, I was talking to my friend for 3 hours, and I was on the phone, but I noticed this pink blade of grass. And I kind of meant to take a picture of it, but I forgot. And then when I got back to inside, I thought, oh, I want to take a picture of that pink blade of grass. And I was telling someone about when I was manic, I was being all creative the very first time with knickknacks. And then I told him about, oh, I need to take a picture of a pink blade of grass. And he said, you're still the same as that, just in a different way. So it's still being sensitive to the relationships of things, just in a different context. And it's still very rich, but it's not as energizing as it first was because it was just such a new state to be in. And I still don't know what my consciousness would be like if I wasn't taking lithium, which seems to sort of keep me slowed down to some extent, weighted down by that heavy metal still attached to the earth. So just to notice a pink blade of grass. And that's the richness. The richness is of perception. And then it's always changing. There's always something new and different. And that's, again, the richness. Instead of always looking for the same kind of thing. When we're not looking for anything, infinite kinds of things can impress upon our sensitivities and speak to us in a different language. It's the language of sensitivity. It's the language of life. Instead of the language of me and what I want. What we might want is for there to be no me. And in this non-wanting state, we have everything. But in a way, it's hard to believe that that's true, because if we watch TV, we see people with things and drama and all that, and we think, well, that's what happiness is. Because it's on TV and it's entertaining. And the people on TV must be happy because they're on TV and blah, blah. Like, it goes on like that. A show that just showed someone sitting there and then noticing a pink blade of grass and then going over and taking a picture of it would not be entertaining. Yet to the one who's able to be in that state, it's infinitely rich in such ways that one would never watch TV.
I was watching a TED Talk by someone named Aaron Bannock, and he was talking about how to be happy by not being your best self. And that resonates for sure, because I've talked about the importance of being one's best self, or that we get in touch with it in mania, but I also feel like I haven't yet rejoined with that best self that I was. But I also have the sense that I don't care, it doesn't matter. So I'm not yet that version of myself, and maybe I never will be. Maybe it'll be something different and better, and it's not even about better or worse. It's just about having that blueprint of how to be as a human being, fully living in the moment. Yet it's important to actually not always be living fully in the moment, because one is around people that aren't living fully in the moment. So one has to sort of default to programs where those are necessary, and that's part of the process of intelligence as well. It's important for me to sort of default to the program of mental patient somewhat when I'm talking to a psychiatrist, not be like, oh, I'm living in the moment, let's go for coffee. Like, they would just think I'm crazy. So, but he said we can't describe feelings. So going for happiness when we can't describe it is kind of off. And I was thinking that with this sensitivity, when we're not thinking all the time, when we're just sensitive, we can't describe that sensitivity. It's a richness that we feel and sense and perceive, and we can give voice to some of it, but we can't fully describe it. So this richness that I'm maybe talking about, I can't really describe it, because if I tried to describe each rich moment, that would be impossible. But one knows when one's connected to it. So one might know when one's happy but can't really describe that. One knows when one is sensitive but can't really describe that. And when we first get connected to that sensitivity, we try to describe it in terms of the me, and we try to describe it in terms of desire and pleasure, pain, and all these ways we're used to describing things, yet that doesn't describe the richness, but that's the only language we know. So what I'm saying is, even to learn the language of sensitivity doesn't mean that a person can fully unfold the richness and sensitivity of each moment. That's impossible. So it's a language of the senses, it's a language of sensitivity. Not just the senses, it's not just I hear this, I see this. It's a sensitivity that is infinite within itself. And we talk about the sixth sense. It's kind of like the sixth sense, but the sixth sense is an infinite sense. It's sensing. It's when all the senses combine, plus the sixth sense. So the six senses, or I've even heard the 9 senses, so it could be the 10th sense, they all meld together and they're fluxing. So sometimes 4 are active, or infinite are active, and it's such a flow that you can't separate those things. And then you can't separate yourself from the sensitivity that you are. You can't separate yourself from nature. I feel like this sensitivity is the richness. And he drew a little diagram where he showed happening, thought, feeling, behavior. So then he was talking about controlling one's thoughts, which that's probably one of the most common notions in terms of happiness, is control your thoughts. And Krishnamurti would say the thinker is the thought. So it's just thought controlling thought. There is no separate me in there controlling the thought, because the me is thought. And trying to control it actually creates the me, because it's this center entity made up of thought. I might have just ate a bug, I don't know. So I drew another diagram, and I don't know if it's true.
and it's just for fun to sort of compare it. I wrote happening, sensitivity, perception, action. And the reason it goes like that is because one needs sensitivity. Otherwise, one isn't going to have true perception. One is going to have deception. And thought is actually deception. And he gave an example of if a train announcement starts and says, the train's going to be late, then there's a thought interpretation of that. Now, one could hear the train's going to be late while looking at a flower pot that is on the platform and have no reaction at all to the fact that the train's going to be late. So what I'm saying is, if there's sensitivity, one could be sensitive to something else other than this announcement. And you know, thoughts in our brain in a way are just announcements, and we're paying attention to them, and then we're judging our own announcements in our brain, our own thoughts. Who's judging that? Like, it doesn't, there's no who there. It's just this it's just this associative process, and these associations create the me, because everything in the brain is associating everything to the me, in relation to me, and what that means for me, and my day, and my efficiency, and blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, there's flowers and trees and beautiful things that one could be looking at. So what I'm saying is, people don't question thought itself. And there can only be sensitivity when the brain is completely silent and quiet, obviously. If one is going to have this richness of sensitivity of all the senses holistically receiving everything, there can't be noise or sound going on. That's going to mess up that algorithm of the beauty, of the flux, of the richness of sensitivity. And it's just this algorithm of me, blah, 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 blah. And it has nothing to do with anything. So I don't think thinking better thoughts, to feel better feelings, to behave better is anything to do with happiness. Happiness, if there is such a thing, is just seeing things clearly. Of course, people can't be happy when they're living according to their own associative deceptions, and that process is creating the illusion of this separate me. And it's not like there's no being or entity there, but that entity, that sensitivity, is being blocked by these sounds of the me, which is thought, going around in circles. So that's association, whereas when one is sensitive, the brain is more on the extrapolative, holographic, quantum processing state. We try to moderate feelings with thoughts, and to me, feelings are a result of thinking a similar thought many times, and that sort of gets congealed into a feeling complex. So then when one thinks that thought again, by picking out that bit of information from the infinity in front of oneself, then one has that feeling again, and one's just addicted to that feeling. And when one is addicted to personal feelings, one cannot be sensitive to the entire universe. One's only sensitive to oneself, the me, which isn't even real. It's just sounds about past experiences. And in a way, if we didn't have those sounds about past experiences, saying that that's actually important, we'd probably just all walk off into the forest. So it's one of the things holding us to this crummy societal structure that we've all created to imprison each other with. I'm going to go back to the hummingbirds. I just witnessed the coolest thing. That woodpecker pecking on a roof. I'm thinking, why would it peck on a roof? But I hear a woodpecker so far away pecking on a roof. And if he was just pecking on a tree, that sound would not travel that far. It's like they have a cell phone, because they're not just pecking on trees, they're able to peck on metal structures that humans have created and stay in contact at further distances. Last night, I was editing my videos, and then I noticed a 30-second clip that I had added after my last video, and I don't usually do that. But I didn't add it into the video. So instead, I was listening to an audio by Krishnamurti and David Bohm, and it was really rare. I'm not even sure if anyone else has listened to it in many years. But the exact thing that Krishnamurti says on that audio tape, it's a cassette tape. I'm using a Discman. Took me a while to find one that works. And it doesn't even have a rewind button. It only has fast forward. But Krishnamurti's talking about the nothingness and how there's nothing inward. He's saying there's no inner. There's only outer. Even the brain is outer. If there are any thoughts, they're outer. And it seems kind of paradoxical to some of the things he says, like the inward revolution and turning inward versus turning for entertainment. But I only realized that paradox this morning. But what was interesting to me is, had I added in that clip, I would have listened to it and then listened to the Krishnamurti talk and maybe not really noticed, but I just finished listening to the Krishnamurti thing, and then I just somehow happened to watch that clip that I made, and I was saying the same thing. I'll put it in here. The magic animation of the universe and creation, and not the inner machinations of blank. And I say blank because it's nothing. There's nothing there. There's no thing inside us. There's no me inside us. And I find that's what happens, is that it's always a reversal of things. Like something happens and then it's not confirmed afterwards, but just the ordering of things. I'm not sure how that works, but I just thought it was pretty interesting, because when I was listening to the Krishnamurti stuff, I was thinking, I've never quite heard him say things this way before. Yet I had just said that same thing earlier that day in self-dialogue, not by planning to say it, but it just actually came out spontaneously. And perhaps that doesn't mean anything at all, except that there's this connection to truth as opposed to speaking from the ego. Perhaps when one speaks as the moment, there's always some relevance to truth, whatever that is. I don't even know what the word truth means. A lot of people talk about it, but it's not really one that resonates with me. Maybe because it sounds so static, and I don't really see anything as static, even though Krishnamurti says truth is a living thing. There's no truth, but there is a truth. It's just this living thing, and being with that living thing and living as that living thing. Yet even that sounds like duality. It sounds like there's a separation, and there's no. separation. So that's what he's talking about with the inner nothing, is that then there's no separation. If there's an inner something, then there's automatically a separation. So yeah, I was just really struck by the fact that I heard something of Krishnamurti that I hadn't really heard before, and it was something subtly profound. And then I watched myself say it, and I had said it earlier that day in a similar way. Yet it didn't feel subtly profound coming out of my mouth, or even hearing it from myself. I was just noting that it was very similar. And perhaps we're pointing to the same thing, and the thing of that is that anyone has access to it, or no one has access to it. Sort of like we need to be nobody in order to access it. Then who's the one accessing it? It's so paradoxical, and it's impossible to put into words, because when one speaks words, another listening assumes there's this separation there speaking the words. And that separation is trying to impose something upon the other separation, but the non-separation is trying to speak about the non-separation so that the other, who isn't even other, sees, or there is a seeing that there is no separation. And there's nobody that can do that there. So trying to see is, again, a goal or a desire which negates the whole thing. So that needs to be negated. And see how the language is just circular. One can talk in circles all day long. And interestingly enough, that's what we do in our head with our ego. And we're kind of seeking for that which sees, and when one sees, one can speak in circles, but from nothingness, as opposed to from ego thought. If we were to share our thoughts in our head, we could probably only speak for a few minutes if we shared all the prominent thoughts in our head that we have on a daily basis. But if we speak as nothing, then we can speak for hours, or not speak for hours. It doesn't really matter. And I have no idea if that's true. It's just a subtleness. And one has to be nothing in order to sense that subtleness and make sense of that subtleness. Even yesterday in my video, when I was editing it, I noticed that that crow finally was quiet. And he was quiet because all of a sudden another crow was calling in the distance. And then it was a different call. And then when the crow that was close to me heard his friend, he had a different sound, and it was like, "Yay, you found me, there you are." And it was so cool just to see that in the background, and I missed that when I was talking. So in talking, we miss things. I was talking to myself in self-dialogue, and I missed that rejoining of the crows. And how much do we miss in actuality when we're talking to ourselves in our head? But we don't see that as actually deleting most of the information. We see that as talking about the information we're receiving. Anyway, I don't know if anyone has seen that experiment. There's a video that, if you look, it's about watching people pass the basketball around. And maybe I'll put the link below this video. I don't generally do that. But just count how many times the person passes the basketball. And focus on seeing if you can get the right number of passes between the people in the video. It's pretty difficult, so keep your eye on the ball. And then next video, maybe I'll talk about the results. And this isn't new, I saw this years ago, but it's just sort of illustrating this again. And I'll make more of a video later. I'm gonna go have some breakfast. I was just at a dialogue and I had this sense to come and dialogue with myself about some insights I might have had. And it seems like the wind wants to talk to me too. And the spot is nice and shady, it's really warm, and I do like the warm, but it doesn't go well with technology. My phone feels like it's gonna explode because it's so hot. Plus the sun shines in my face, or it's shining in the screen. Blah, blah, blah. And we were talking about social responsibility and sort of some of the debacles in the world right now. And there was this I'm not sure, I don't generally talk about dialogues I have, because generally I don't have dialogues with other people but myself. So I'm not sure if I want to give the context of the dialogue or just the insight that I had, but I'm sensing that. I came up with a question: what happens when we don't see any problems? Because there's the whole idea about problems out in society and what can we do about them. But if we meet another person with the background of the problems of society, we're not really meeting that other person. And if our awareness is focused on the problems of society, then that will prevent action in the moment, because we're not responding to the moment, we're responding to the programs of societal problems we've been trained to respond to through media. And when we have that in our awareness, there's no way we can act fully adequately in the moment. So what happens when we don't see any problems? And that's not to say there aren't any problems. But if we're meeting the moment with past problems, we can't meet the moment and solve a problem in the moment that's actually there. We can't even see that problem, if there is one. So Krishnamurti would say the brain has to be free of all problems in order to solve problems. So if our brain is full of problems and we meet the moment, we can't solve anything. And I wrote down that problems are just words. So I could be thinking about the words of the problems of society right now. But that's just a bunch of words, and what's actual is what's right in front of me. And I think I want to go through some of it quickly because there's so much of it, and I don't want to be editing videos too much. Maybe one a day, not two. And I was thinking about thoughts and how when our thoughts are continuously going, they lull us to sleep, just like TV noise when we're falling asleep. It'll make us go to sleep for a lot of people. Whereas if we're just about asleep and somebody comes in the room and turns the TV on, it's going to wake us up. So I was thinking that when there's more space between thoughts, then arising thoughts might actually have more of a waking up effect. But when they're droning on constantly and repeating, then they actually just lull us to sleep. And I was only thinking about that in terms of maybe thought appeared in evolution or in the consciousness of human beings as a warning system. And there was some element of being able to predict and think about things. But it has taken on a life of its own and established that there's this me thinking, when really it could just be thoughts arising in consciousness that have some value if they're spaced apart. But if there's no space, it drones on, and then we're actually asleep while we're awake, because that thought stuff is going on and our attention is on it, so we actually feel like we are awake, because it is supposed to wake us up in a way. Not supposed to, but originally it was to
perhaps help keep us alert, just like somebody coming in and turning on the TV right when we're about to fall asleep. It would wake us up. It would be a jolt. But it's no longer a jolt because it's just one after another after another. So perhaps thought with lots of space, with no thinker. So there's no problem with thought innately, but to think there's somebody thinking the thoughts. And that happens when there's no space between the thoughts. Because the non-space, the constant drone creates this illusion of a thinker. Whereas if it was a thought and then 2 minutes later there's another thought, there would be no thinker. There would be no constant noise for one to think that there's something thinking the thoughts. And that goes along with what Krishnamurti said in that talk that I was mentioning, that there's nothing there. So when there's no inner, when there's no internal, when there's nothingness, there might be a thought, but it's not my thought. It's not I'm thinking a thought. It's just something external, just like the tree. And so I did kind of see what he was saying with that. And I thought of a question: why do we meet people with all of our problems? Why do we meet people with that background? Why don't we have a blank brain? The common brain of humanity, the common consciousness. And somebody in the group said, how do I be sane in this situation? And I was thinking about that in terms of mental health. Because if everybody realized that it's hard to be sane in this situation, there might be a little bit more compassion for those people that appear to go temporarily insane. And people brought up knowing what's going on, or the need to know what's going on in the world. And I was thinking, is that really what's happening? That's what it says in the news or some media, but is that really what's happening? And even if it is, that's what's happening somewhere, and it's a very small bit of reality. And it's not even a real bit of our reality because it's something we can't act on. In that way, it's sort of an outlier. And in science, they just ignore outliers. So perhaps it's something that it's good to be aware of that outlier, but they don't design their science and the rest of their life around the outlier. And it's an outlier. It's lying and getting us to believe it. And it's not that it's not true, but the more we put our awareness on it, it's just this food that is poisonous, and it's draining our energy that we have to act on things that are actual for us. And for me, I see the hummingbirds, that's actual. And that's going to change my neurophysiology in ways to see more hummingbirds in nature and be connected with that beauty and see beauty and have the brain attuned to beauty instead of all the toxicity in the world. And I brought up the example of listening to the news for 2 hours is not even as powerful as smiling at someone spontaneously for 2 seconds. Because that one thing is actual, whereas the other is feeding the incapacitation. There's capacity in smiling, whereas there's incapacitation in listening to things that we have no capacity to affect. And then we have our attention on that and less attention on the moment where we could have some kind of effect. It's mass distraction against our own brain. We're distracted from the present moment, which is the only place we have the power to act or do anything. And the other thing too is if we listen to the news for 2 hours, that is going to actually decrease the probability that we're going to smile at the next person we see. So it's going to get us so distracted that we're not in tune with our gestural apparatus, which is the thing that can actually do something. So I feel like focusing on problems decreases our responsibility in the moment, our ability to respond to the moment. We're responding to something programmed. It's programming, and that is altering our movements throughout the day. We're being warped by that programming. Responsibility has nothing to do with shuffling words in one's mind. If we have a river of words in our minds, we can't see the river and flow of light hitting our perception. I actually feel like words are trapped light. It's interpreted light and saving it for later in memory.
And I actually realized that that's recorded holographically. So in a way, as we move through reality, when we record things in our memory, we're actually putting out this algorithm of a holographic net, which is gathering the light, the image, as well as the sound, which is the word interpretation of what that means. And the more we do that, the more we're only seeing those interpretations overlaid on the present moment, and we're picking that out holographically. And I feel like really we need to shed that algorithm of holographic recording in order to have a quantum brain, not having the interference of the interference pattern of the holographic memory that we have. And that's old light and old sound that is distorting our brain. Because it's old light and sound distorting, we can't see the relationships and possibilities and collapse wave functions. Because our wave functions are already being collapsed by the waves of light and sound that are old, the interference pattern. And I feel like when we think about social responsibility, if we think about it as problems out there and then we can't do anything about it, we're thinking we can't do anything about it, and that transfers into the moment. And then we don't act in the moment because we're busy reacting to the problems that we heard on the news, which are sounds and images we recorded in our minds. If our awareness is on thought, it's away from the moment, and then that is inaction because we can't act in the moment. So thought inactivates action. And somebody asked, where does action come from? And I feel like action goes with perception. And they were talking about action as opposed to reaction, or response as action as opposed to reaction. And to me, reaction is reacting to thought or acting based on thought programs, which is old. So it's reacting, acting out a program. And the question of freedom came up, and it's freedom to observe without choice. Because choice is the judge. It's picking out the bits to react to. And somebody mentioned flow as non-separation and how it was seamless. And I wrote, it's seamless when the one that seems to stop seeming. And somebody mentioned it's superficial to stay separate. And superficial is relating based on the images of thoughts and reacting. And I see that the depth or the deep is being with the whole totality and being that and being as that. Then one is just that depth without having to think one is deep. Because the thinking is the surface and the depth is all of it, everything. So in a way, when we're carrying those thoughts and programs, we are that superficially, whereas if we're everything else to the exclusion of that superficiality, then we meet everything with that depth. And I was thinking about the Truman delusion, or how some people actually feel like they're on the Truman Show when they go into map consciousness. And I was sensing that that is when one actually connects with the fact that one is the watcher, one is the seer. One is that by which we see. But in that sort of sense, there's still a sense that I'm also that which I observe. So that's sort of when the observer is the observed, but it's a strange sensation, so we feel like maybe we're in a movie or something. We are the watcher watching ourselves. And I feel like seeing is required for response, for action. And I wonder if there's a happening that happens without saying what's happening or what happened. And when we're seeing based on our thoughts, which is not seeing at all, we can't see the messages from nature. We can't read nature. We can't read that richness. And when we can't read that richness because we're reading
the past, then that's when everything else comes in. We are each a perspective of light and life. We are all life from our particular perspective. And we talked about looking at oneself, and I feel like it's more like looking as the self or the one self. And that means having a clear brain. If we all had blank brains as human beings, in terms of me and my desires and memories and stuff, we would all be able to see the same thing, because we wouldn't have all these past things getting in the way. And so in that way, can we look as that one self, that one consciousness that we all are? And I had a sense that the dialogue was also self-dialogue, because it's just different aspects of the one self talking to the one self. And I feel like dialogues are living conversations. And it seems even in daily life we want to share meaning, but usually we end up having conversation about the meanings that we've been programmed to talk about on the news or on TV and things like that, because we can't see the messages and the meaning of our daily life. And if we could see that, we wouldn't talk about the past stuff and programs and all of this meaningless stuff that we think is meaningful, because we're bombarded with it. And we're bombarded with it so we can't see the present moment and see the meaning in the present moment and talk about that. And that would be dialogue. And I had this sense that human beings are dialogical creatures, or even that life is dialogical. It's having this dialogue with itself. And it is sharing meaning. And any interaction and communication, there has to be a sharing of some kind of meaning, whether it's at the energetic level or subatomic level or biological level. There has to be this understanding. There has to be this exchange of meaning, this flow of meaning. Yet, as humans in our daily life, we share and base it on the meing. So the meaningless meanings we've been programmed with to talk about blind us, and that blindness prevents us from seeing meanings in the moment and sharing that. And so in terms of changing things, if we can't share meaning about the moment, nothing's going to change. Because if we're just sharing meanings about memories and things we're told are meaningful, they're no longer relevant. And somebody raised the question, do we need to step away from that? From our programming and image making and thoughts? And I feel like there's nobody there to step away from it. But also, when we see that we don't even step away from it, we just drop it, because it has no meaning. If we saw we were carrying around a rotten egg for the last 20 years and it was so rotten and disgusting, we wouldn't say, oh, should I hold on to it? Should I step away from it? We would just drop it. But the trouble is, we think those images and things still have some kind of meaning and value. Like, oh, maybe I can sell this rotten egg on eBay because I've been carrying it for 20 years. Maybe I need it in case one day I'm starving and I just happen to have this rotten egg. I can at least eat something. And I feel like, again, this holographic algorithm is this net that is recording the lights and sounds according to the past recording of light and sound. So it's just a slight variation, and it's just recording all the examples of that algorithm of what it is we're supposed to be making meaning of. And those things are meaningless, so then eventually we have this accumulated life and memories of all of this meaningless stuff. And that could be the allostatic load as well. And that's what needs to be dropped, is that algorithm and and seeing that that algorithm has no value for recording, and dropping it with all of its recordings. And it's kind of like, why don't we see that thought equals blah? It's blah, 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 and it's just blah, blah, blah. And can we realize when we're speaking and acting and reacting from the blah, blah, blah? Can we get to quantum perception? It's the quantum algorithm of seeing and collapsing the wave function into actuality, instead of continuing along the trajectory of dirt roads, which is dirty light and sound. All these old dirt roads in our consciousness. And I was actually thinking about Dr. Daniel Siegel's term allostatic load, and I actually think there could be a term called holostatic load, which is the accumulated light and sound images that we have recorded in our brain, and how that is stressful and it's a reaction, and those reactions cause emotions, which those molecules block receptors for absorbing nutrition. So by emoting based on this holostatic load, we're actually destroying our body and not seeing life. The holostatic load is the me and all of its recordings. And do we know when we're speaking from our holostatic load? Or are we speaking from the quantum dynamic perception that we have, the flow of light, and not capturing that light, not recording it, because it can't be captured, it can't be recorded. If we don't record it, we're seeing something new all the time. There's always something new. Even if we sat on a beach by ourselves for the rest of our life, if we had dynamic quantum perception, we would see something new continuously. And we would be that new. Our thoughts are touching us and guiding us or misguiding us, as opposed to our whole senses and perception. And I wonder, do we speak quantum, or do we speak holostatic load? And I feel like in order to speak quantum and dynamically, we first need to see possibilities, or relationship, or life, and speak as that life. Just now I was trying to find a spot to make a quick video, and I was by this glass building, and when I was next to the glass, there were so many reflections on my iPhone screen that I couldn't really see myself. And I don't even need to see myself, but it made me feel like it's going to show up on the video, but maybe some of the reflections would. My point being, when there's all these extra image reflections all over the place, it's kind of disorientating, and that's what we do when we think thoughts overlapping with reality. And that goes with part of what I wanted to talk to myself about, was how today it feels like every perception is a communication. It feels like the opposite of so-called psychosis, where each way I turn looks like the end. And it feels like each thing I see is a rich communication that could be participated with infinitely. Feels like communication overload and creation overload. And since there's no real desire or motive for anything in particular, anything could be the thing that one goes with. Like, I went in this building and I wanted to see if I could get the speakers to work because I want to play a cassette tape from a Walkman on speakers. Don't ask me why. And so I tested the speakers with my phone and I played a song that I made on Fruity Loops years ago, and then I just started getting kind of dancey, and then I felt like singing, and then I sort of had this sense that it would be cool to explore making music again. But I was also feeling this sense of my heart being tugged to still help people like me. And I hope that maybe one day these videos might help people like me a little bit, but help in a more direct way. And I don't even know what that is, but I'm reading a book, On Our Own, by Judy Chamberlain, and it was written in the early 70s. And the stuff she's saying makes it sound like it was written today, because it's all the same issues, if you want to say issues, just slightly different, and slightly things have progressed since then. And people who haven't been through it would say, oh, it's progressed a lot, but in going through a lot of that stuff myself, the external structures are maybe a little bit more humane, but the internal paternalism and things like that is all still there and just as harmful, whether very direct or subtly. And so that's tugging on my heart a little bit, and knowing that some of my friends are struggling, and I'm in this beautiful place and I see how great it is for me, but I've been having this sense of sensing other people's feelings, and I don't know if I am or if it's my own feelings, but there's stuff arising that I'm looking at and wondering if it's another message or if it's actually stuff from me, and maybe there's no difference, but actually I had a sense that these thoughts and different things that come up are actually an urge to communicate. So I hadn't talked to one of my friends in a week, and I only really noticed a couple days ago, partly because time goes by so fast here. But then when I noticed, I noticed that thoughts started coming up about, oh, why haven't they contacted me? Or, oh, I could contact them. And then this morning I just realized I can just call that person, because these sensations popping up in consciousness are an urge to communicate. Not to say, oh, why haven't you called me? But just to communicate, and then in communicating, all those wonderances will be answered. So I noticed that because I've been thinking quite a bit about communication today, and how everything is communication, even a movement. So if I hear a sound and I look, I'm wondering what that is. And it could be, oh, an orange fell out of the tree. And that's a type of communication. It was the movement of the orange that communicated something to me, but at first I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what that meant. And then I found out it meant an orange fell out of the tree. And we may say that to ourselves or not, but the next time I hear that, I might not even look. I might just know that, oh, that was an orange that fell out of the tree. And how that relates in a way to thinking and overthinking is that when we're thinking all the time, we're not really looking, because we think we already know. We're thinking based on past experience. We encounter a situation, we think we already know about it, so we're not really looking at that situation
for new information, for new sounds, for new communication. We're hearing the old communications of our recorded thoughts and experiences. So I wrote something down about that, but I feel so many impressions of insights today. And in a way, maybe one insight is enough to have insight. And I wonder if insights are to continually have insights or for something else. And I sat and I watched this little hummingbird on the top of a tree. The top branches are bare, but the rest of the tree is all full of leaves. And this little bird was making his little machine-like, squeaky, chirping sound on and off for a good 20 minutes. And sometimes he would fly away for 30 seconds and come back. I'd look, he wasn't there, and then he'd come back. And I knew he was looking for his friend, or a friend. And it took a while. It could have been 20 minutes to half an hour. And I was sitting there watching, and I just felt this sense of this little being and how valuable this little being is, making his cute little sound. And I just felt, I don't know, I just felt very beautiful. And then finally, I actually heard, probably at the same time the cute little bird I was watching heard, another cute little machine-like squeak sound off in the distance, but not too far, because I don't think this sound travels too far. And then immediately the one that I was watching turned its head and just flew off the tree so straight back the other way that the sound came. And while he was flying, he made this little chirping sound that was totally different than the one he was making before, and he was making it as he was flying. And he just sounded so excited that he found his friend, or a friend, or it just seems so intentional what the bird was doing. And it's really fascinating to watch these birds call each other and sort of sit and wait for the other bird to enter the radius of sound and receive that communication. And I feel like our talking to each other as human beings might have started as calling out danger, or just communicating from afar while we were in the fields or whatever we were doing. And in a way, it was partly to communicate danger and partly to assess the situation and communicate that. But now we have this thought going on in our head all the time. It's always a danger signal. Any sound inside the head is just this danger signal going on and on. It's two little butterflies after each other in a good way. I saw two hummingbirds yesterday do this like loop-de-loop around each other, facing each other a couple of times. It was like a dance. It was so cool. I feel like I have so much to talk about, and that my self-dialogue has changed slightly since being here. And I also feel like in being here, I'm very fortunate. In a way, I've temporarily escaped that paradigm. But my friends aren't so lucky. And I've written a bunch of stuff down today and yesterday, and it's getting to be a lot again. So I decided I'm going to also share my notebook pages each day as I write them.
because this, oh my gosh, that's the smallest lizard I've seen yet. It's way over there, but it's tiny. Anyway, distracted by nature, that's a good thing. I love those lizards. I feel like the sense I'm having about helping people is a communication. And somebody I know wrote something that I read that was pretty powerful in terms of also acknowledging that the way people are being treated is not very nice. And the sad thing is that people think it's good. But those people have never experienced it before. Or are being paid to keep that order as it is. They've been educated to take a position in that established structure. So I might get to go to ECPR next month and hopefully bring it back. Where I just feel like I need to start working on that which I'll be working on when I get back. Because, I don't know, I guess my fear, I could talk about my fears around it if I have fears. I'd like to imagine I don't have fears about it, but I have fears about the unintended consequences. I partly fear that by going that path, I'll end up back under the power of those who are part of that system, and I don't want to be a part of it anymore. I guess part of it is focusing energy on that co-creation project that I want to put some energy into. Because if there's an element of thriving there, then that thriving energy can be used to help people who are just struggling to survive. And I guess that's my fear, is I know that I could be back in that situation of just struggling to survive in the snap of a finger. But I also remember that when I went to the hospital 2 weeks before I was put in the psych ward, I was 90 pounds and my friend took me there because she thought I was dying. My hair was falling out, and I was waiting in the lobby to be called, and I was so tired, even though I hadn't really slept at all. But I remember putting my head on her lap to fall asleep, and when I did, I experienced being in a womb. And then I experienced being in my own coffin, and I could hear my sister talking, and I felt like I was taking my last breath, and also I felt like I was going to crap my pants. Like I felt like I did, actually. And then all of a sudden I just stood up like a lightning bolt. And I thought I yelled out, "I stand for..." my niece, or "I stand up for my niece," meaning so many things, that I need to still be alive, to be there for the people I care about, and also that I want to be around to make changes so that the next generation doesn't have to go through stuff like this. And I guess at that point I decided to live, even though I was put through hell in order to, I don't know, who knows what it all means, but it was also weird because when I got taken into the next part of the hospital, I was sitting and all these people were across from me, and my friend and I were sitting on one side and they were on the other, and every single person went in, but nobody else came in the room after. I was the last one to go in to see the doctor, and nobody else came in, and it was really bizarre because it was a busy hospital and there's lots of people out in the other waiting room. So it was just so many bizarre things. It's symbolic, it's a communication, who knows. The point is that after I read this thing that someone I know wrote, I won't go into details because I try not to give any kind of details about anybody. And I just felt like this person just really stands up for people. And then I remembered that promise I made to myself. And oddly enough, 2 weeks after that, I almost died again. But then I was taken to the psych ward. So sometimes I grapple with how necessary all of that is. And part of it then is, how does one communicate this with love and not with fear and hate? Because that doesn't help. It doesn't help me, it doesn't help anything. But I gotta go. I have to make some food, and maybe I'll talk later, but I didn't even get to my notes, and maybe if I just start taking pictures of my notes and talk to myself when I can, more organically perhaps, then who knows. It's just been one of those rich and beautiful yet sad and interesting days. Maybe it's that there's so much beauty here and I just wish more people could see this and feel this. So just know that if I ever do release this, it's with the utmost respect for humanity and out of love. It's a beautiful evening, and I just captured some video of a bird that was just as curious about me as I was about him.
Hey, bud. Come on, bud. Come on. Come on, buddy. Come here, bud. Come on, bud. Come on, sweetie. Come on, sweetie. Hi, sweet. Hey, you sweet. Hey. What's up? How's it going?
And I remember when I got here a month ago, he was particularly friendly that day too. Also, I met a lizard this morning that I thought was dead. But I think he just stayed out past his bedtime and got too cold to move.
Lizard stays out past his bedtime.
I'm not sure, but I'm sort of learning the language of nature around here. And I've been having lots of insights lately, but I haven't had a chance to talk to myself about them. And I'm not necessarily feeling like it right now, but perhaps I will try anyways. I was seeing creativity as communication, or communication as a creative act. And I was thinking about the efficiency of thought, or how we try to project our partialities onto people and situations and things in order to evaluate and measure if they suit our desires. And that process is always going on. And I realized that it's not really that efficient, it's actually inefficient to be in a state of mind where the brain is always learning. Is actually more efficient, not learning and seeking according to a particular pattern or path, but just learning. And I was realizing that because I was doing something, but I had to walk between two places 3 times, and it wasn't really that efficient, but each time I made that trip, I learned something else. So even though it was seemingly inefficient in terms of the goal I was trying to achieve of a certain task, it actually had learning aspects that I wouldn't have seen had that not happened. And I just sort of thought of that in terms of how we plan out everything so efficiently and how it actually is inefficient. So moving according to the patterns of thought, which is programming and efficiency, is not moving according to life. And life, which is not a pattern, is actually more efficient. But it's an efficiency in an order that thought can't recognize and doesn't see as valuable. And thought tries to write over life. And I was thinking about this epigestoretic thing and how the other day I said to someone that I liked their shoes. It was just a random stranger. And then they said, "Oh, thank you." And so their response is sort of recorded in their body and in the fact that they smiled and said thank you, and recorded in mine in that they responded in that way, and in that I gave that appreciative compliment. And I feel like that actually is recorded in the universe. It's in the fabric of the universe. Maybe just because it's in the fabric of the bodies that participated in that transaction. And that's something that can't really be measured exactly, but it's something that really matters. So I was thinking about how even though in society we have all these measures of success and things, the universe, the quantum computer of the universe, is measuring those other things that matter, those things that we can mirror to each other, that are actually encoded in our neurophysiology. It's being recorded in our neurophysiology because we can recognize it. So what is it that we want to mirror and record and recognize? Because what we're recognizing is what we're measuring. And I feel like it also knows the incongruence between what we're saying and what we're thinking. And I noticed somebody who had cramps and they were hunched over in pain. And I was thinking about how psychological pain is what gives us tension in our body as well, to make us slightly deviate from our natural trajectory center of gravity. And that is also stored in the matter of our body, because gravity has a different pull on our body when we're out of alignment. I was thinking about how when we learn a new word, then all of a sudden we hear it everywhere. Well, when we see a new world, that world of map consciousness, then we see that world everywhere. So if we get a glimpse of that world and that energy and that language and that being and that consciousness, then we start to see it everywhere. And then one can get led into map consciousness. But it's difficult to remain there because that's not the dominant energy. And we go to the edge of that and then we're scared back. It's like a flux. It's like a wave. It's like the tide coming in. Our brains are experiencing the energy of this wave, of this tide. And I read this paper, and I haven't looked at it fully, but I have to read it again, and it was talking about something about 30 milliseconds, and I think that's almost the shutter speed of consciousness. And I feel like in life we go about life sort of liking and disliking things, just like on Facebook. And it's a very superficial algorithm. It's very superficial evaluation of things, to just be like, well, I like this and I don't like that, based on past. And we're only seeing our past patterns projected on the present and evaluating the present based on that. So it's not even what is happening presently. It's like the 0 or 1. It's very binary. Whereas with the quantum algorithm, the brain is in a state of receiving many different impressions, the whole quantum of information, and seeing the possibility and collapsing the wave function around the possibility. And that's what happens in map consciousness, is that we see the possible world and how beautiful it is, and the potential world. And by seeing it, by observing it, we collapse that into reality more so. So we're almost explorers of that and mapping that territory. And we'd love to be able to come back and say, hey, this is what I saw, this is where I've been, in consciousness, energetically, having one's perception changed and shifted in order to see that as an actuality right here, right now, that anyone can see if they shift their perspective. But instead, something else happens when we come back. And I feel we need to hold the superposition state in our brain, not knowing, not evaluating. And in a way, that's what happens when we get confused. It's that we're holding multiple possibilities at once. And when we don't choose based on like and dislike, we become the quantum. The quantum selects and learns, not this accumulation called the personal self. And quantum perception is non-personal, because the personal is the ego, which is yes, no. So when it's not just yes, no, binary, good, bad, like, dislike, based on one's own personal recorded images, then it's quantum perception. And I feel the brain is trapped in image making, shuffling, reorganizing, accumulation, knowledge, and not response, communication, creativity. The mind operates on infinite possibility, whereas thought operates on yes or no, approach, avoidance. And through the mental health system, new perceptions are converted and explained in terms of that program. It's explaining away possibility and potential. We live in our own virtual reality map of thoughts and images and sounds overlapped with actuality. And in map consciousness, we're mapping actuality. It's a living reality where anything is possible, because we could meet somebody that makes something very possible for us that we didn't know was possible. But if we meet somebody and that's the person that can make something possible, but we meet them with our old thought structures, we might discount them over some trivial detail, yet they were the person that was potentially going to facilitate something unfolding between the two people. I feel like choiceless awareness is letting perception play on the senses, like a musical instrument. Our senses are like notes. I feel like problems are virtual reality because our brain has been trained to see problems. So seeing has problems superimposed and interwoven in it. So anything we see, we usually see a problem or a desire, which is a problem because we want something, so it becomes a problem because we don't have it. But this problem making is programmed into us, so it's always from the past. Seeing isn't a problem, but seeing has been made into seeing problems. If we can see clearly, there is no problem because we can respond adequately, so there's no need to see it as a problem. It's only a problem if we're seeing something that's not really there and then trying to solve it. Or meeting life according to programming. Thought is a serious and persistent mental illness. It wants to continue, and then we're out of sync with the actual. We don't harmonize, we have harm in eyes, we have harm in our eyes. The light coming out of our eyes divides us from what's actually happening now. I was pondering the term thought process, and so much of life is devoted to our thinking and our thought process, and I was wondering what other process is there? And really, there's so many other processes, the most fundamental being the process of life. But when we overlay our thoughts on life, we translate life according to our thoughts. That which arises is not a problem. Don't make a problem out of that which arises. Just see it, and then when we see it not as a problem, then we can see anything beyond problems. And when we see thought as a process, we see we are not that process, and then we're outside of the process. We are not the thought process. We're a human being being processed by thought. We can be thought processors or quantum processors. I feel like being choiceless and afraid is psychosis. To be able to maintain map consciousness, one really has to have no fear and love and compassion. And love is choiceless awareness. Life is fluidity. Life is the fluidity that allows movement. It's not just the structure. That lizard I accidentally killed is dried up, and it's the same structure, but it doesn't have that fluidity, which is life, which is movement, which is communication, which is creativity, which is love, which is perception, which is action, which is freedom and intelligence. And we think thought is the fluidity that allows movement, but that rigidity, that programming, that sound actually probably is that 30 millisecond thing, that vibration that is actually stopping the fluidity of life. And I feel like thought is a type of gravity. It creates a center of gravity, and we gravitate towards that which we think about, or it gravitates us, or it creates a separate me. This sound is this vortex of gravity that creates this separate me, because we're not in our fluidity. We're rigid, and we're moved out of our center of gravity by this sound. Sound has something to do with gravity. I feel a little bit out of rhythm with my self-dialogue process. So I'll just sort of start talking about some things I have written down, and they're kind of out of order, I think. Not that it matters. Somebody said the term sound current, and my brain reversed it, and I was wondering about current sound. Do we speak current sound? Do we speak the sound of now? And what is the sound of now? And that voice in our head is the sound of a million yesterdays. And I wonder if we can create a current of current sound, because all of society in our lives is based on these sound programs, these word viruses, internalized and turned against us in our own voice. But it's a reversal of this current of sound when light creates the sounds that we say versus old sounds and images. And I feel like when that happens, we might create a sound wave of the now. When we speak as the now, and that's part of speaking and seeing and thinking together. And I wonder if we are present, if our gift is sounding the now. And I was thinking about self-dialogue in terms of a skill and the 10,000 hour rule. And I calculated that to be 3 hours of self-dialogue a day for 10 years. And I think that includes the editing part too. But also, in terms of flow, I don't think that one needs 10,000 hours in order to have that as an art form embedded in one's neurology. I feel like through self-dialogue, the sound programs that inhibit this process get erased, and there's no real time limit on how quickly that can happen. And with map consciousness, one can be thrown into that other dimension in an instant. So it's not even a matter of time for this particular process, because dialogue is a living quality, and we're already that living quality. So it's not about time in order to have that as a skill. And the unlearning doesn't take time, it's available now. But I think the part that seems to take time is encountering other minds that see and communicate in this way. And I was thinking about how if we work 40 hours a week for 5 years, that's 10,000 hours, and we become skilled at that. We become experts at being a slave to whatever that job is. And a lot of times it's not fulfilling. So through the work that we're doing now, the structure we have now, it's actually making us masters of being slaves. And that only takes 5 years to get our 10,000 hours and be indoctrinated into that. And no wonder university degrees and things are, 4 or 5 year programs, is because then we're fully indoctrinated into that way of seeing the world. And now that I'm in conversation with one of my friends to have some sort of dialogue, I'm wondering if in a way we're brain soulmates. And we'll see. And I feel like the brain is hungry and starving for this, for dialogue, for this form of communication, of seeing and thinking together, not just sharing opinions and battling. That's all based on conflict, whereas what is true communication that is creative? And I really feel it's a language of light and perception, and how our brain's perception translates the light of seeing into sound and gesture, sound and action. Why do we speak the language of me? When we speak about the me, it's like speaking about a phantom illusion. So even all this mental health stuff, in a way, is trying to make that illusion more real, but in the ways that that illusion is allowed to be real. And that illusion is all the programs that we enact and react to. And part of this new language that we start to encounter when we go into map consciousness, it's actually releasing all those programs, all those images and sounds. And the trouble is, oftentimes we actually react to them as if they're real. But when they're coming out of our nervous system and appearing as so-called hallucinations and delusions, and they're really intense because they're an accumulation, if we can really just see it as that illusion and be still, it will likely just evaporate. And I have to explore more with this myself. And I feel like that stuff needs to be released to be more in touch with reality. And I wonder if we can speak as the light, meaning information, without superimposing our past images and interpretations on it, and being with the actual. And when we're with that, and speaking as that, then we can work with the actual and create something that's not just an abstraction. And this illusion, in a way, is sort of like when we have an eyelash in our eye and we get the eyelash out of our eye, we stop poking at our eye and we just see. And we don't have to be curious about the eyelash. It was just this obstruction. We don't need to analyze this eyelash. If perception is action, is not freedom that of perception? Freedom to perceive. It makes me think of the book, The Politics of Experience by R.D. Laing. It's a really interesting book. In a way, part of being diagnosed is saying it's not okay to perceive that way. But I feel like the process of map consciousness is freeing our perceptions, and part of it is releasing old perceptions and image recordings from the past all the way back to the beginning of time, not just personal images, because all of it is stored within our bodies. But at some point it becomes pruned and integrated, and part of that is the dialogue process. So our actions aren't free when they're directed by thought in the past. And when that thought image sound complex is released, we're free to see and act in the moment. I once heard Krishnamurti say in a talk that meditation is a perfume, a beauty that pervades all my activities. And in a way, I feel like when we go into map consciousness, we get in touch with that. We just feel this beauty that is pervading our activities and whatever we're doing. And with that beauty, it doesn't actually matter what we're doing in particular. We don't have goals and objectives. It's just that underlying beauty that is all that matters. And if you've experienced that state organically, you know what I'm talking about. So then all of this goals and all of this success and all of this thing loses all its meaning when one has all meaning flowing through one's system and emanating from it. And then he talked about how then there's creation in one's living, not in the expression of it. So just in one's daily life, not in trying to create particular expressions. And I feel like I did connect with that. And that doesn't even matter if I connected with it or not. And part of what I shared about people selling the flow state is that I feel like I take medications to not connect with that flow state. I feel like map consciousness is dissonance with the way society is designed. So we as human beings are living creatures. We have consonance with life, but the structure of society is superimposed upon living things, and it's this order that is structured by thought, but thought isn't the living things that it's referring to and attempting to organize. For example, it would be lovely to say, okay, everybody in the world is going to go pee only at 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. And that would be ridiculous. Yet we say everybody should go to work at 9 a.m. and leave at 5 p.m. And that's not seen as ridiculous. But it's still, again, a false structure. It's not according to the biorhythms of living and life. So that's just one example. And so when one goes into map consciousness, one is living according to the biorhythm of the mind, the collective mind, and seeing and perceiving in the moment and acting. But there's thought structures and false structures in society that people bump into, through other people and different systems that aren't according to life and the biorhythm that this other person is going according to. And then when that person, that living being, bumps up against these thought structures and systems and has a reaction, and those reactions accumulate, then all of a sudden one is seen as needing some kind of mental illness label because their life energy was obstructed by thought structures of society. And because thought is not life, but we all go based on thought, we categorize people as unwell, when I think these people are the ones that can give some kind of measure of whether society is structured according to life or not. Because for every person who's diagnosed with something, there's probably 10 who are like on the verge. And that says more about society than individual people. And the fact that individual people are having very similar quote-unquote symptoms is more of a symptom of the established framework and how it is designed to create that kind of so-called symptomology in living beings, because they don't fit into the structures of thought and society. It's just, and those aren't even real, they're just imposed. I feel like we could play the 100th manic syndrome game. There's the 100th monkey syndrome. I feel like if 100 manics got this, those perceptions and actions could change the world, because they're of a different quality. The living quality of the brain when one is in map consciousness is different energetically. And I never talk about really desiring going back to that other state of consciousness, because it's of little consequence if I'm there by myself. And in that way, I feel like other brains are required to see this and think together. And it's not about thinking in a certain way. It's about thinking in so many ways, because part of what happens in the process of map consciousness is that our brains are open to a different way of thinking and seeing. Not thinking according to what we've been told and programmed and knowledge, but thinking according to perceiving the entire mind, the whole world, the complexity of it. I feel like if one brain sees the complexity of it all, it short circuits the brain, because that one brain can't handle or do it all. Or when one sees all that and all that energy goes in the nervous system, that whole blueprint and pattern, it needs to be gestured into sharing. So part of this thing is, if a lot of people have been given this blueprint and vision, but then their vision is changed into, you have this personal problem called a mental illness, then the vision isn't shared and considered. To me, it's possible that it's what Albert Einstein was referring to when he said, today's problems won't be solved by the same level of thinking that created them. It's a different level of thinking and seeing. And I actually feel like it requires people to collaborate and cooperate and be creative together, because one person can't physically unfold all that the blueprint portrays. It would be like asking one person to build the tallest tower in the world. Like, it'd be impossible. Maybe that's how the pyramids got built. Everyone could see it and think it and feel it and do it together. And they really had this vision of what was necessary, and so it just got built. And they could see something that other people couldn't. So even from today, we look at it, we're like, how did they even build that? But in a way, we think about things in terms of seeing them with separate brains. Like 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 5. But when the brain really thinks and sees together, it's logarithmic. It's not just 1 plus 1 equals 2 in terms of the body's strength. But we've never done that, so we don't understand that. We don't see how that works or see how that's possible, because we don't see in terms of possibilities. But if one brain that sees and thinks in terms of possibilities and vision works with another that sees that way too, it's almost like two quantum computers working together. It's not just two linear sound structures of thoughts from the past that are irrelevant working together and recombining old bits. So yeah, who knows? Who cares? None of it matters. I have some catching up to do. So right now the sun is behind the tarp and there's nobody around, so it's a good time to talk to myself, because part of it is I don't like sitting in my room and there's not a ton of comfortable places to sit. That was a hawk. So I feel like words in our nervous system move us. So we're hearing our voice in our own head and in our own nervous system, and we're moving according to that, or in discord to that. But we think it has some kind of bearing on reality, but that is what is actually moving us. We're moving in the field of past. And in so-called psychosis, we feel like those words are actually going to move us towards destruction, or those words are telling us about the destruction of the world and the universe. And in a way, can we go into that fear? Can we really stay with it? Because when we run away from it, then we end up in the psych ward. So the only other option is to stay with it and let those words disintegrate. It's like the nervous system is being excited through those words. Those words have an excitatory function. And when the nervous system is being excited in that way, will those words be reabsorbed, or will they disintegrate, or will they sort of evaporate? Like, what happens there? I don't even know. And I feel like in map consciousness, our nervous system is no longer a binary switch of our own dopamine reflex. There's something that happens that turns off that dopamine reflex. I was almost seeing it as something this morning, like when the brain cells mutate, I wonder if there actually is some kind of cis-trans thing that happens in the fat cells in the brain. As if more cis fats, and I'm not saying this is how it is, but I almost just saw it as a kind of switch, because cis bonds are like this, and trans bonds are like this, and cis bonds are like this. So in a way, all it takes is for this to go over here, and then it's a trans. And actually I'm seeing that that's sort of the honeycomb. The first time I was in map consciousness, I saw this honeycomb thing, Well, I kept being attracted to honeycombs and monkeys and bananas. Maybe it's like, if monkeys eat enough bananas, they become humans and blah, blah. I don't know. Anyways, my brain is just picturing things, but I feel like there could be some kind of switch in the fat cells in the brain. And when that happens, we no longer speak me, we speak as the now, and as curiosity and wonder, and as perception and action and learning. It's like the learning switch in a way. And that could have to do with the fluidity in the brain, and that could be one of the reasons why fish oil and omega-3 fats are so beneficial, especially for people that go into map consciousness. And in a way, they say take omega-3s to prevent psychosis to some extent. There's studies on that. And I always wonder about this whole like preventing it versus going into it thing. Because preventing it is like saying, well, that is bad. And yes, it can have some terrible stuff, but part of me feels like we could design a reality in which that kind of brain state is actually safe, and it doesn't really matter if somebody is in that. And maybe they wouldn't even seem like they're in an altered state because the conditions are suitable for it. Whereas if society is terrifying and then a person is in a sensitive state, they're going to react to all that, and then they're going to seem unstable. But really, the societal structure and the so-called stability is what's unstable. We're not designed to be so robotic. So it's almost like the life of the brain responding and reacting to the roboticism of things. I'm not being very clear with that because it's something I haven't really thought about. But I do feel there's some kind of switch in the brain because it doesn't take time to go from me to we. It is like a light switch to go into so-called mania or magic or map consciousness or trance consciousness. It's just being one with the mind, and it's when the mind uses the brain to create itself through humans. The mind using the brain to create itself, which is a statement by Dr. Daniel Siegel, implies humans being instruments of the mind, not instruments of thought, not playing sounds of thought on our biological instrument. We're humans, and that means color. Hue means color, and what thought colors is very limited. It's a very limited framework, and it changes what we see. It warps what we see. It warps the colors and the beauty of what's out there. And when we see beauty and when we are beauty, we create that beauty. Just like a flower, without trying, just by virtue of what it is. And I feel like I speak crazy. I'm just a crazy person when it all is said and done. And I think I mentioned that crazy could be a path to enlightenment. And part of the path is, I feel like it's a reverse path. One becomes enlightened very quickly. Possibly. And then what happens is that one realizes that it's crazy to think that we can be personally enlightened. And we get shown that there's no such thing as personal enlightenment. Because when we get to that enlightened state and we think, I'm God or something, all of a sudden we realize that thought, I am God, or I am enlightened, or I am powerful, is the negation of that enlightenment. So it's over. So it happens quickly. I'm God. Boom, now we go through hell because we've gotten to that place personally without everyone else. And that's not how it works. So as soon as one sees that one is there, one is not there. And then the one that obstructs being there, the ego self, is back. Because the ego is what says, I am powerful, or I have this enlightened state, and I'm going to help people or something. Or so, again, that's thought and ego structures and structures of society superimposed on that other state. So one goes into that powerful brain state. There are powerful brain states, but as soon as it's attributed to some kind of personal me or success or powers to help others, then it's gone and it's distorted. And the trouble is that now that powerful brain state is distorted, and so it becomes powerfully distorted, and the brain in its powerful state can create all kind of powerful, scary, terrifying, awful stuff to scare us back into the regular world and not necessarily crave those powerful brain states. But people are doing that all the time with different substances and things, like trying to get these personally powerful states to be able to see things and perceive. But we can perceive in daily life. We don't need powerful brain states for that. So there's some contradictions there. And that's partly why I feel more people have to see it, or so many people have seen it, like they've been in that powerful brain state, whether it's through some kind of so-called mental illness symptoms, which are just really the brain has gone beyond the power of the structures of society, and society's like, that's not cool. Or one can take a drug and be there temporarily and then come back and be like, wow, that was so wonderful and powerful. So people have seen it. But how do we speak it, and how do we still see clearly? Like, it's wonderful to have a powerful brain and be forced to see clearly because the brain is in a powerful state because of some kind of drug or temporary extreme state. And it's another to look with clear eyes in daily life. We don't really need some kind of chemical or high state of the brain in order to do that. And in a way, seeing clearly in daily life and being attentive to that can clear out the brain to be in a highly perceptive state, in wonder and awe and all those things that feel magical when inducing those states somehow. But in daily life, and it happens in such a way that it doesn't really feel like anything different than one's regular state, and the regular clear seeing state is fine, and one actually doesn't want anything more intense than that. That might happen, an intense state might happen, but there's no wanting and craving. I feel like we need to play with words to see beyond them. And that play, the play of perception, creates the words that we say. And speaking that language of the moment, I don't really feel like thoughts create reality. That is the old structure. Thoughts make salient very limited bits in our reality. Like that monkey video I talked about, how you count the basketballs being passed around intensely, and you count like 10 or however many, and spoiler alert, if you go back and watch and you don't focus on counting these basketball passes, somebody in a monkey costume walks right through the freaking screen, and it's pretty incredible that it walks right through, but our brain edits that out when we're focused on counting the basketball passes because that's what we've been told to do. And so thoughts creating reality isn't that. It's just like saying, count the basketball passes, and then that's all we'll see. So our thoughts are like the basketball passes. We're watching those thoughts, and that's what is making us see what we see. Yet there could be a freaking gorilla right in front of us and we're not seeing it. There could be something so beautiful right in front of us, but we're not seeing it because of our thoughts. So all this hoopla about thoughts creating reality, when we believe that, then it's really easy for whoever to just throw all these thoughts out into the world that they want us to believe, and then that's all we see. And then we're imprisoned. I would say thoughts imprison our reality. They limit our reality. And I was thinking about perceiving and acting as the moment, which is dynamic, which is life. Life is the moment, and it's always changing. Yet we as human beings, we don't change. We have this me structure that is static and trying to remain consistent. In a way, that's the static in our nervous system. It's the word static. It's the noise going on in our own voice, imprisoning us and keeping us not living, but warping ourselves according to our thoughts and sounds. So the me, the who we think we are, is not the right role for the moment. It's static. The right role for the moment is to roll with the moment. I feel like the beginning of map consciousness is purging the old images and thoughts and sounds from the nervous system, the old holograms. And so we see those things and we hear those things, and they're temporary. It's sort of like molting those holograms. And in a way, since we recorded those things in our body, in our minds, in our brains, we have to almost see some of those recordings in order to delete them. And then our nervous system becomes fresh and new. Those are sort of those images and sounds are embedded in our nervous system and prevent us from seeing new things, because we're filtering according to the old. So now our nervous system is clear and we're not filtering, we're just feeling the moment exactly how it is. And we're also not used to feeling and perceiving with all of our senses, not just sound. So the mind is starting to use our whole being to create itself, and we don't understand that language, and we're not used to having the mind as what is instrumental in moving our instrument. And this richness removes the duality of good and bad. It's perception of richness, which is life, which is the living process. We all have access to this richness. And if we were sensing and saying in this way, there would be no experts and people that don't know. If everyone could see and say in this way, there would be no doctors and patients when it comes to this. We would all speak the same language, because in map consciousness we have access to different perception and language making and the way we use language and communicate. And that form of communication is seen as pathological by those who don't speak that language. But we all speak that language, or some kind of combination of it, because if we all speak that language all along, there wouldn't be this hyper-perception that seems like a deviation from normal modes of being, because we would all flourish and flower and grow in that way from the beginning. But we're warped away from being able to do that through our education as children. This is our natural way of being from when we were born. I don't think that if a child was left to its own devices, it would just naturally become a psychiatrist. Very few. But we create this program for people to learn how to perceive people in that way, because none of us know how to perceive anything ever. I think it'd be more helpful for somebody who's a so-called psychiatrist and somebody who's a so-called mental patient to go on a nature walk together and talk about nature. And the person who is diagnosed with something would actually have a lot of things to teach the so-called expert on how to see and be in the world and nature. Map consciousness is perception, it's vision, it's the language of vision. And thought is a language of division, of dividing us. And so people go into these visionary states and then come back, or are forced back, and their vision is divided up and categorized and said to be pathological by those who have a very limited lens from which to see somebody who has gone into that state. I feel like feelings are efficiency. They block sensitivity. By having an emotional reaction, we can no longer really take in any more information because we've already figured it out in reference to me, what that means. And I feel like people who go into map consciousness, they are super sensitive, and then eventually those sensitivities are seen as hyper-emotionalism, when a lot of those sensitivities are actually for the world. It's a sensitivity that's non-personal, and that's why it's so sensitive, because there's no personal stuff blocking it. And I also feel like when one gets overwhelmed and then there's too much supposed emotional buildup, that gives a reason for professional people to bring that person back to so-called reality. It's like the end of the adventure, just like people in space might have to come back before they run out of oxygen. People in map consciousness space need to sort of come back before they get into this accumulated stress that is seen as over-emotionalism, and it's usually interpreted as personal emotionalism, but it's actually non-personal. But it can only be seen as personal by those who only see in terms of the personal. And I was listening to a talk by Krishnamurti, and he was talking about how thought is a material process. And he was talking about how when that process ends, it's still a material process. And he said it has freed the brain from its conditioning. And I feel like map consciousness is a state that is trying to free the brain from its conditioning. And I feel like the sensitivity is choiceless awareness. I wonder if, like the crows, I can use words and sounds to find my friends. I was listening to a talk by Krishnamurti and David Bohm, and Krishnamurti was saying that there's no inner. All is outer. And I can see what he's saying. He was even saying thoughts are outer, the brain is outer. We think there's this inner, but really it's all outer. And it comes from this point of infinite emptiness, which just means there's no me, there's no inner entity. And I wonder if we can have perpetual perception instead of perpetual thought. Thought perpetuating thought. Can the mind perpetuate perception? And when the brain is free of the me, it's the same brain. We all have the same human brain. It's the same flower. And I feel like map consciousness is when the inner wastage of energy stops, and the brain, instead of gathering recordings, gathering holographic recordings of images and sounds, is gathering energy. It has this net of gathering energy of perception, not divided up by sound and thought. And the dividing is the recording. And then we record it in our nervous system, and then we can only see that. So we can't perceive, we can't act adequately, we can't gather energy. And I can see when we gather the energy of perception and action, we're gathering vision, we can see, we can extrapolate. And then that part sort of has the requirement of sharing. Because if one is gathering up actual perception, one can share that. Because that harvesting isn't just for oneself. Mainly because it's so much energy that sharing is part of it. And maybe when one has gathered that energy and is living that in gestured ways, that is the beauty that is infused in all actions, and then one is just naturally sharing it without trying and doesn't even know that one is sharing it. And I wonder, why do we predict instead of perceive? Thought's always trying to predict what to do, what to say, preforming sentences. And when we're doing that, at the same time as being, then our whole being isn't perceiving, it's only partially perceiving. We filter everything through the computation of thought, when there's a different computation that the brain does, the living algorithm of the brain's perception with unimpeded senses. And when the brain is working in this way, it becomes a direct translator of the whole energy, not partially divided up by thinking, which is what continues to divide up the world.